Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Viktoriya Fedorchak. I'm a senior lecturer and docent in war studies at the Department of War Studies at the Swedish Defense University. Today, we will have a lecture devoted to the professional military education in Ukraine. We will discuss various developments in the PME in Ukraine, and we'll see how it evolved over the last couple of decades and where things are standing with the current ongoing war fighting and how PME actually fits into all that. So let's get started. Everyone who's discussing professional military education these days or over the last good century or so, sooner or later mentions this quotation from Thucydides. The society that separates its scholars from its warriors will have its thinkers thinking down by cowards and its fighting by fools. This is an important warning about not being able to balance thinking and actions together. In professional military education, it is very important to address both. When we talk about various components of the fighting power, we do have a physical component, we do have moral component, and we do have a conceptual component. And conceptual component includes the thought process, where we are working on how people think, how they develop their ideas, how we develop leadership the way it needs to be in the current strategic environment and in the current developments of the battle space. So it's very often that each country, each nation, and alliance in general needs to decide how they manage to strike this balance between the conceptual component, physical component, or between the thought process and the actual actions and preparations of the future military professionals for the battle space. So this quotation is always a good context to remember how this balance needs to be achieved, and this balance needs to be kept in mind when we are discussing PME, and Ukrainian case is no exception. So we can talk about the structure of the professional military education, some institutions that are present in the country. So, of course, the umbrella and the primary institution and the broadest, especially for the strategic level, would be the National Defense University of Ukraine, or NDUU. It is often focusing on the strategic level courses from L3, L4, and L5, according to the NATO standards framework. Some other more service-specific and domain-specific institutions would be Hetman Petro Sagaidachny National Army Academy, which is located in Lviv, and it's responsible primarily for the preparation of the army, but also NCOs in Ukraine. Odessa Military Academy, based in Odessa, is devoted to the preparation of the Navy personnel. Ivan Kozhdub Kharkiv National Air Force University, historically based in Kharkiv, they were responsible and continue to be responsible for the preparation of the Air Force personnel. Zhytomyr Military Institute, named after Korolev, they focused on radio engineering. Obviously, these are not the only professional military education institutions that are operating in Ukraine. However, they are the main ones, and others would be focusing on more niche elements and more niche preparations of the required personnel. Obviously, through the post-Cold War times, various changes in terms of names and mergers were taking place, but these are the institutions as they stand today. Yes. One more thing to remember, that these service-specific universities, they are focusing primarily on the tactical level preparations, usually L1, L2 courses. So this is kind of an important distinction from the National Defense University of Ukraine. So this is something to keep in mind. Important thing to remember is what were the developments in the post-Cold War era for Ukraine and its professional military education. Well, first of all, we need to remember that after the end of the Cold War, there was this tendency to reduce the numbers of the armed forces, and as a result, there were fewer budgets to be devoted to the military, but still the emphasis was on smaller military, but focusing on some of the improvements of the quality. So here, although we see lack of funding, and there was the necessity for finding a new direction for the development of the armed forces. This direction was found in the standards of the Western military and the NATO alliance, and they became formal direction for the development of the armed forces in 2007. From 2000s onwards, we see greater presence of the NATO frameworks like Partnership for Peace and DEEP programs in Ukraine. As you can see here, since 2013, NATO DEEP assisted 11 major Ukrainian PME institutions. The main areas for collaboration, areas for improvement of the quality of education refer to the curriculum standardization, as we mentioned, L1, L5 courses, teaching NATO standard decision-making planning. Also, another very important element was improvement of proficiency of the English language, because English language was viewed, and actually it remains, and most likely will be for the foreseeable future, one of the means for improvement of integration of various curricula, and also one of the means of better integrating of PMEs between the alliance, Ukraine, and actually global PMEs in that way. Another development was various teaching visits and exchanges with the Western partners. They were not as systematic as one would have wanted to, but they were based on individual contacts, which still managed to develop some good exchange of know-hows and curricula, and also some knowledge about training and exercises, and actually facilitated future exercises and training activities between Ukraine and allied nations that followed from 2010 onwards. So these kind of were the developments at the time. Another important element to consider is actually post-Cold War military experience of the Ukrainian armed forces. In other words, there were no very detailed or systematic training per se in Ukraine. So where people would be getting experience, and this operational experience that would define how you would be fighting and how you would pursue the battle space. Well, actually, you would see a lot of involvement of Ukrainian armed forces, Ukrainian military, in various UN, OSCE, and other overseas missions. So this would be lots of peacekeeping, but still that would be the way to gain some of the skills to have a better knowledge about how things are done within the UN framework, but also to work with various Western countries, Western military, which was the way to actually gain this know-how and experience. Another element that contributed to the skill set of the Ukrainian armed forces were actually two revolutions in Ukraine. Another element besides actually how to build resilience, how to sustain people's ability to conduct various activities under restrained circumstances. That also, these two revolutions, they brought in something like volunteer movement, which became quite crucial core of the support for the Ukrainian armed forces during the Russian full-scale invasion in 2022. So again, all these things kind of were building up to what we have today. Then, of course, we have the war fighting of 2014-2015 with Russian annexation of Crimea and invasion of eastern Ukraine. So this was the first kind of war fighting experience that was kind of built into the skill set that Ukrainian armed forces will be using during the interim years of war, but also in 2022 onwards. So this is where we see preparation for a specific war, and the war with an exact threat, exact enemy, that would be Russia. Again, then we have 8 interim years of warfighting between 2014 and 2022. These were years of preparation, but also, as I said, this was the time to focus on specific type of warfighting, knowing Russian way of warfare, how they were conducting things, having this numeric superiority, how to undermine that. So many exercises, many training programs were focusing on how to undermine them across different domains, across different case scenarios. So that was kind of an important time of preparation for the Ukrainian armed forces. And then, of course, today we have the 4 years, well, more than 4 years of full-scale invasion from 2022 to 2026. So we observe how fast the battle space has evolved, especially with the drone warfare. We observe how the skill sets have changed. And also we observe how various Ukrainian military that are fighting the war right now came from very different backgrounds, but they brought their own skill sets. Civilian businesses, IT background people, they still contributed to how we conduct warfighting here. Many would argue there were different reasons for that. Some would suggest because they were not trained in the military. However, what we observe is that it's a combination of what military knew previously, what the environment of warfighting was, and what people brought from the civilian life, which skills they had, and how they could contribute to the achievement of post objectives. So we kind of see very interesting combination of backgrounds and also skill sets that contribute to one goal, to fight against the invading force. Another important element to consider in professional military education, and specifically in Ukraine, is how to combine lessons learned from the warfighting, from the front line, and their adoption in the curriculum. Well, for Ukraine, it's obviously easier to do it because the warfighting is happening in Ukraine, and many things, the information flows pretty, well, relatively freely within the military circles to find what's happening, where to learn from best practice and to learn from some mistakes, obviously. But also there is a bit of institutionalization of lessons learned, and we see that each PME institution in Ukraine has its specialist for gathering lessons learned from their ongoing war fighting, which then are incorporated into the curriculum. So again, as some would say, we're learning as we go. So curriculum might be set based on some formalized elements. However, the case studies, the most recent developments, they being introduced as some lectures are taking place, as some of the tasks are being taught to the to cadets. So these things are kind of pretty fluid. Another interesting element here is that the majority of military topics are taught by the military with the relevant degrees in MPhil or PhD degrees in their respective subjects. So we observe that there is still this kind of combination and balance, having people with the military background or still serving military gaining academic degrees in pedagogics. Some would be more technical in engineering, and then having this opportunity to teach. So that teaching wouldn't be just, indoctrination of some practice, but that it would have this strong pedagogical background and how strong pedagogical basis for it. So kind of trying to get the most from both worlds. Yes, hands teaching is also strengthened by the individual experiences and situational awareness of the ongoing warfighting. In other words, very often, and when people have different contexts and different services, they can bring in those experiences and they can build their entire cases on those experiences, just to showcase how various theoretical and conceptual frameworks are reflected in the existing battle space in Ukraine. So I think it's a very important thing to consider and emphasize. Facilitation of restricted data into teaching. Again, another thing. It's how should I put it? The distinction between, there's obviously a distinction between classified, restricted, and open source information. However, when you have warfighting happening in your country, you need to teach, you need to learn on the stuff that is really happening rather than, some abstract things. So here I think teaching using some restricted data allows you to have this better ability to teach what's really happening, how to adapt to this type of circumstances, and evolve according to the changes in the battle space. Again, this is just something to consider. And I would like to talk also about the case of the Kharkiv Air Force University. We've been working with them for quite some time, and despite being dispersed across Ukraine, so obviously Kharkiv Air Force University is no longer based in Kharkiv because it's been constantly bombed by Russians. It's been dispersed across different parts of the country, but despite that, it's fully functional. It's conducting lots of work in preparation of the future pilots, engineers, and ground-based air defenders for different services and for all of the needs that Ukraine has. So it's an incredible achievements of the university. Another element is that people didn't just focus on what's happened in the battle space. They still preserve the academic side and pedagogical side of teaching. And here we see the aim, the objective of actually bringing in more of the international content, international know-hows, and skill sets into the curriculum through various means. So we see they are conducting vibrant international collaboration, including their annual international conference, which should be happening at some point of April this year. And they are combining what's happening in the warfighting in the aerial domain with best practice and also various perspectives of the allied nations. So that, again, not just focusing on Ukraine alone, but also what are the standards, what are the best practice happening in the or being developed in the NATO countries. So it's kind of trying to combine the best things from both worlds. In terms of Swedish Defense University, I collaborated on behalf of the university. I collaborated with the Kharkiv Air Force University within the NATO Science for Peace and Security grants, and we won one on the Advanced Research Workshop on logistics in support of aerial operations. It was a great collaboration. We managed to gather people from different NATO countries, but also partner countries like Ireland and obviously Ukraine as one of the grant applicants. So, and we talked about different things related to the various aspects of logistics in support of air operations, but also resilience and what is the role of air power in the modern warfare, but also in peace support operations and any other settings. So that was quite vibrant discussion, and we had it in September 2025 here at Swedish Defense University in Stockholm. Another thing that we're working with some other partners, that's on the picture you can see the three of us standing there, and we are conducting various activities with the Swedish Army project Footmark System, where we're discussing different developments in the battle space, how air power affects what's happening on the ground, and various ways of air-land integration. So this is kind of things that we are working on. So there are lots of interesting initiatives and lots of things are happening, basically. Yes. NATO standardization. Obviously, since Ukraine chose the path towards NATO standards, we see that there has been the ongoing process of improving the standards in the curriculum for the last few decades, if I'm correct with the numbers. But recently, the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine summarized some of the achievements and arguing that NATO experts acknowledge significant progress in professionalization of military education in Ukraine, following some of the main points that were emphasized in previous reports, but now they were kind of fulfilled to a greater degree. First of all, is the establishment of multi-level education system, as I mentioned, L1 to L5 courses, and as I mentioned, how they were distributed. So I know people who were working on their development, and although it was stressful, but they still managed to achieve significant progress in that area. Then we see the incorporation of planning and decision-making procedures, again, in accordance with the alliance's practice and also standards. So we see that also being incorporated into the curriculum. Integration of leadership principles and the mission command. Again, this refers more to the training programs. But again, it's not just observation of mission command as it is in the battle space, but also trying to conceptualize it in accordance with NATO practice, but also in accordance with Ukrainian strategic culture. And there are some interesting similarities and also some peculiar elements in the Ukrainian strategic culture there. Then strengthening of the English language proficiency. This is a very important one, and I keep emphasizing that English language allows Ukrainian professionals access to so much more information to actually link what's happening in Ukraine with best practice, with NATO standards, but also with military doctrines, but also academic environments, because we observe that with the English language, more and more of Ukrainian military professionals getting access to these areas, but also they are publishing more works. If you look into the Western journals, there is a significant increase of the Ukrainian authors among the authors of the articles on Ukraine and the modern warfare in general. Formal recognition of military professions within the national qualifications framework of Ukraine. Again, from the perspective of professionalization of the armed forces and the military profession, it's very important because previously there were some, obviously, other views on the matter. Furthermore, Ukrainian PME had successfully integrated into the framework of the European Security and Defense College. Again, it's a very important network for collaboration for the Ukrainian armed forces. So it's a milestone and it's a significant achievement. And a few points on current trends and development. So as we mentioned, NATO standards combined with the development of the practical skills needed for the modern battle space. So again, as I said, the best from the two worlds, more conceptual, more doctrinal elements with what is required for the battle space and dictated by the battle space, to be honest. Focus on proficiency in English language, as I said, internationalization, integration, improvement of interoperability, both civil military and across civil military in Ukraine, but also civil military across international, national levels. Improvement of qualifications of the teaching personnel, combined international practice. So again, here we see also greater focus on improvement of the skill sets of the teachers, sending them for different courses, NATO courses, improvement of English language, but also many others. So to see how things are done in other countries. So these exchanges are quite important, especially under the conditions of the ongoing war fighting. Sustaining connection with the wider European academia and improvement of civil-military relations and knowledge sharing. Again, it is no longer a very secluded world as it used to be, I don't know, during the Soviet times. Ukraine is becoming more present in the European academia, both civilian and military, and I think it's important that this connection continues through different exchanges, through the curriculum, through even some online lectures, because it allows to have this knowledge flow, understanding, but also integration of different practice and putting things together and having a more systematic approach to understanding warfighting and also conducting warfighting in accordance to the requirement of the current strategic environment. And as I tell to my students at the end of my lectures, questions, suggestions, complaints. If you have any of those, do contact us directly. We'll be happy to answer your questions, to hear your suggestions, but even send complaints. We love those as well. Thank you very much for your time. Take care. Bye-bye.